Hello and welcome to Fascism on Film. I'm James Kent. Along with me is Teal Minton.
Hi, how are you today?
I'm good, Teal. No, I know you're talking to the listener. So we're going to be talking. Our main film is going to be Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds. But the overarching theme and the title of this episode today is called Everyone Loves to Hate a Nazi. And the reason we call this episode that, and we focused on Inglourious Basterds, is we're fascinated with how when you needed a villain, especially in a war movie, the real go-to where everybody could get behind was the Nazi as villain.
Yeah, and it's been that way basically since during or even before the war. The Nazis were the easy plug-in villain, and they still are. You know, we throw them into Indiana Jones, and so it's not just. I mean, I guess that Indiana Jones takes place during the war, but it's not a movie about Nazis. It's just let's throw in some villains. The Nazis are good. They're unspeakably evil. They look scary in their uniforms, and audiences love to hate them. It's like an instant trigger in your mind. You see a Nazi, you go, oh, there's the bad guy. I'll be happy when they get killed.
Well, interesting enough, when we talk about Raiders of the Lost Ark, that movie takes place in 1936. And so the world isn't at war yet, but the Nazis are in power. And Indiana Jones' archaeological nemesis is a French archaeologist. And of course, he is teaming with the Nazis. And so as a subtext, Spielberg knew that there were, a whole bunch of people that were willing to work with the Nazis. And of course, It didn't take much for Germany in, 1940 to occupy France, and they started with a half occupation and eventual a full occupation.
And Inglourious Basterds takes place in Nazi occupied France, and I think the second part of the film is in actually Nazi occupied, and the first part it doesn't actually say. It just says once upon a time in Nazi occupied France, setting us up for this sort of Nazi fairy tale.
I think you just answered your own question. It takes place in Nazi-occupied France, so maybe it's. But you know what? Let's give Tarantino the benefit of the doubt, though I don't think he was actually that much of a historian. He's a movie scholar more than he's a history scholar, and I think that's important in terms of this movie because, as a lover of cinema, this film riffs on cinema and relies on cinematic history of the war.
Yeah. And I think it's more about that than it is about the actual war about Nazis. It's a movie about World War II movies about Nazis, about how they're depicted, about how the whole war itself is depicted. It's a movie about World War II movies in a way. And it's, I think by the end of the film, that theme is really explicit.
Yeah. And also it's about subverting expectations. We talk about Nazis as villains, and they, were great fodder for many years. We don't really get a lot of films today where Nazis are villains, except in, what was it? Is it a Finnish movie or a Swedish film?
Sisu, yeah, it's a Finnish movie, Sisu, about a old guy, a soldier who finds a bunch of gold out in the wilderness, and the Nazis want the gold, and it's basically a 90-minute movie of this guy just slaying Nazis in the most gruesome and graphic ways possible in an over-the-top way. It's supposed to be sort of cartoony and entertaining, but it's basically a movie of a guy just slaughtering Nazis, and we kind of root for it. I mean, we do root for it because I think as moviegoers, we don't have a lot of empathy for Nazi villains. And so when they do get killed, we can cheer. We are complicit in that destruction.
But I also think that because the Nazis are so identifiable, and again, this ties into the costuming, the pageantry, the symbology, because they were all about that, it's very easy to pluck a Nazi into the movie
Yes.
and dressed them up. And now I mean, as early as maybe 3 years old, I had, without knowing anything about Nazis, I knew who the villains were because
Yeah.
I was being babysat by my grandmother, my dad's mom at the time. My parents were somewhere, and I was sitting on her lap, and for whatever reason on the TV, she was watching The Great Escape.
Yeah.
And it was my first introduction. It's one of the earliest movies I remember. And I, as a little kid, could quickly identify, maybe as like you play with army men,
Yeah.
there were good guys and there were bad guys. And quickly, probably as like the Nazis were the bad guys. And then these other soldiers were the good guys. And you quickly learned who
Yeah.
was good and who was bad. And that kind of throughout all films, without me really even understanding the history or why Nazis were bad or what did Hitler do. I mean, that would take a few years. I still knew, well, these are the bad guys.
Yeah, and it's like that Star Trek episode. I remember seeing that at a really young age, where they travel back in time, and it's the Nazis, because their uniforms are so distinctive and the symbols they wear and the swastika and stuff. It's just, as soon as you see that, you know, here's a bad guy, here's an evil guy, and the hero needs to stop them somehow or escape from them, as in the case of The Great Escape.
It's easy sometimes to get lost in what did the Nazis actually do? What made them so bad? So that today, if somebody calls you a Nazi or a fascist, it becomes a 4-letter word, right?
Yeah.
I always joke, my joke about this show, rather than calling it fascism on film, we should call it the F word, because it's naughty. Nobody wants to be called a fascist, even if their behavior or their actions are so. And part of the reason why we wanted to do this show and look at these movies is so that you could start to understand, well, what does make a fascist or a Nazi? Or what does it entail and involve? And talk about different facets. And in this case, in the movie, I'm not saying that, because I know a lot of people love Inglourious Basterds, and I love it too. And sometimes I'll watch this film because it's very rewatchable. I'll rewatch it and really love it. And other times I'll be like, yeah, okay, I see. It's just a few scenes, basically.
It's basically a few scenes, but I do love the film.
I know, but I mean, I do love it. I just, at one hand, I don't know how deep it is as far as thematically about, say, having anything to say about authoritarianism or fascism. But what it does say in terms of looking at our viewpoint of villainy is interesting.
Yeah, it definitely does, and it creates this Nazi villain, this Hans Landa character, who is the closest cinematic analogy I think would probably be from This Land Is Mine, where you have what I call the cultured monster, where they're refined, intelligent, sadistic, kind of charming. They're civil. They have a little bit of class. The barbarism is sort of held underneath a little bit, and that's what he is. And he really relishes in talking to people and making them feel uncomfortable. And he brings with him, I think, as all Nazis do in every movie, is they bring with them the threat of violence. So as soon as he shows up, we know that violence is not far behind. And I think we see that in every Nazi type, whether they're this sort of cultured monster or the other Nazi character is the Boy Scout in this movie, who's sort of the clean-cut, idealistic, seemingly honorable character, who's the movie star in this case.
Yeah, and a lot has been said about the opening sequence of the film, and it is probably Quentin Tarantino's greatest 20 minutes of film in any of his movies. And if you take that scene away out of the movie isn't probably as good. However, that scene is so incredibly great. It is one of the most tension-filled, brilliant interplays between two characters that you're likely to see. And it's the reason why Christoph Waltz won an Oscar. And it's still, every time you watch it, doesn't matter. It is a great scene, and it's really something you can study on how you build tension.
Absolutely. And it also sets up this fascist dynamic really well in a very small contained space with limited characters. You've got the cultured monster Nazi, Landa. You've got his henchmen who are there with guns, who are essentially, they are the threat of violence that he's bringing. You've got the farmer and his family, who are the occupied people who are just trying to get through. And then you've got the oppressed people under the floorboards, literally under everyone's feet, just trying to survive, and he's trying to hide them there. And that is basically a sort of a microcosm of the entire French occupation. And it plays out so carefully and such a to stretch out that tension. Once we've got the promise of violence, you can stretch out the tension a little bit, and that's what Tarantino does. Not just here, but in a lot of his scenes and films, the threat of violence is then extended to create that tension. But in this case, that tension has historical significance and has the weight of all that history on it. It's not just a crime scene.
After this sequence, where an entire family is wiped out under the floorboards, one escapes, Shoshanna. The motives seem unclear as to how she's able to escape, other than Tarantino isn't always concerned with plot trivialities.
Yes.
He just basically says, well, I'm going to need these characters later for other things, so let's just forget about how could she get away. And the question, I think, resonates through the entire movie in interactions that later Shoshanna has with the villain Hans Landa, played by Christoph Waltz, whether or not he knows who she is. Because he seems to always be playing a game that he knows all the moves he's going to make, and he prides himself on the fact that nobody else knows the moves he's going to make.
And he amuses himself by watching people struggle under his moves. And you're right, it is moves. It's like he's playing a chess game with these people. And if they lose, he sends them to a concentration camp.
He looks at it and says, well, I'm going to let this play out because I'm not so concerned. So there's a scene that's almost a repeat of the opening scene, but this time it's with Shoshanna and Hans Landa. It's very, very similar. But he's trying to see, like, A, does he not know her, or does he know her and he loves toying with a prey and seeing if he can make her slip up? But it's also still tension filled.
Oh, yeah, yes, absolutely. It's tension filled. And the whole last sequence, well, there's the sequence in the cafe, which is tension filled, of course, because they're pretending to be Nazis. But it's sort of the same thing he plays out over and over again, where there's this threat. And then we have maybe a little bit more of a casual dynamic playing out, but the threat is going to explode at some point. And in that cafe scene, everyone dies.
It is interesting is that Tarantino sets up this movie that's almost just, it's in chapters. And so it's kind of like 5 chapters, I think. It's kind of a strange way to make a film, and it kind of keeps it from being like an action movie necessarily, because all of the action is going to be within these scenes. And almost every scene has kind of that same similar write-up where it's going to be tension and will characters fill and where is this going to go? So in one hand, it's repetitive, but it's also done on purpose, I think.
Yes.
And then it does end up with this final scene, and we as the audience come up against history because these bastards are sent in on a mission to try to foil up the lines a little bit before D-Day invasion. And then ultimately there's a film premiere that's going to happen where, again, you mentioned earlier, this kind of Boy Scout Nazi who was like America's Sergeant York in World War I, where he kind of is a man alone, but he faces off against all these enemy forces, which would be the Allies, and he mows them down and survives, and they want to build this guy up into some kind of deity because it helps the war effort.
Exactly. He becomes a propaganda hero. They make a movie about him where he plays himself as the guy in the sniper tower holding off hundreds of soldiers.
So there's going to be a screening at this theater, which happens to be run by Shoshanna, and there's going to be a lot of dignitaries there. And the film is a tribute to a soldier who Shoshanna's met. The Reich is propping him up to use him as sort of a propagandist tool to help the war effort, because despite what Germany was saying to its people, they were not doing well. They were losing in Russia, which the German people didn't know. And they knew there was going to be an Allied invasion. So anything they could to boost morale would be great. And the exploits of a sniper who faced off against unsurmountable odds at the hands of Allied soldiers and mows down a whole bunch of them, kind of their version of Sergeant York, that was appealing to them. But the high command in England learns that the Fuhrer is going to be there too. So we're up against a history that we know, and this adds tension, that no matter what happens, the bastards are probably going to fail, because all of these high-ranking German people, including Hitler, weren't killed at this point.
Yeah, so there's that tension for the audience between how much of this, it starts with the once upon a time, how much of it is a fairy tale and how much of it is sticking to history. And it does introduce that tension with this screening. And you're right, this guy, this Frederick Zoller character, who's the sniper, sort of starts up a friendship with Shoshanna, a little bit of a flirtation. And we actually start to maybe like the guy a little bit, even though we see clips from this propaganda film within a film where we see him just being a murderer, essentially. And he's being glorified for violence in this screening. And as you mentioned, yeah, it's, there's all these stars from Hitler's Hollywood are there. Heinrich George, Emil Jannings, Goebbels is there, Hitler is there, and
Goering is there.
Goering is there, and it all comes down to this plan, Shoshanna's plan, to blow up the theater with all the Nazi officials in it and essentially end the war in one night.
But the bastards are not working with her. So they have their own
Right.
plan that they didn't know until like the night before that Hitler was going to be there. And so they have no idea that Shoshanna is planning on blowing up the theater.
Right.
And they themselves have a whole scheme that relies on a German actress who's a double agent getting them into the screening, and then she is injured in this firefight that happens in a bar.
Another one of those scenes where the tension is there the whole time and then everyone dies at the end.
Almost, yes. And of course, then again, with the tension that we have is that with Hitler being in this theater, and we know what the history is, things don't go well for the bastards because Hans Landa figures it all out.
Yes. He's always a step ahead.
But then because he sees what is likely to happen, he knows that Germany will never win the war. Something immediately happens that the audience does not expect is he, instead of taking the bastards out and killing them and preventing the plot from happening, he's thinking this is an opportunity for me to get out of this scot-free. And he wants to work with Brad Pitt's Lieutenant Aldo Raines and end the war early by letting the bastards carry out their plan.
And it's really interesting switch for his character because we've thought of him as being ideologically a Nazi and as this cultured monster Nazi who believes the party line. But at the end, it turns out that he's actually a self-interested Nazi. He will do what he can to survive for himself and doesn't actually care that much about the war or the bigger picture. He just, he enjoyed his job as the Jew hunter, and now he'll do something else. He's not attached to the ideology. It's a very interesting switch for his character.
And I think that's, it's a term that was given to a guy, I think he was from Sweden.
Quisling.
And Landa is a bit of a Quisling where he's going to go whatever way the wind blows. And I think that we see that a lot of times in authoritarian regimes as they prop up. You look for the Quislings, those who, may not support what's going on, but they're willing to stay out of the way and maybe help by the fact that they won't resist. But other times they're very friendly to the government.
I think of them as cooperators, not collaborators. Of course, Hans Landa is is more than a collaborator. He's actually a Nazi. But when you think about the French people and how they're going along with this, some people sort of cooperate a little bit to survive, and some people become full Vichy collaborators.
One of the reasons why I picked this film right after the last film that we did, which was The Last Metro, is that I saw some interesting similarities where The Last Metro, a theater company, and they are trying to stay ahead of what's happening in history and the Nazis. And then you have this film, but it's about films, but Shoshanna is many ways feels like Catherine Deneuve's character. And I was reminded when Catherine Deneuve has been holding it all together, and you'd think that she doesn't have a care in the world and that there's not like this weight of her husband being discovered under the floorboards, in a sense.
Yes, under the floorboards again, yes.
That she has that right before the opening curtain of the new play, she pukes, and it isn't about being nervous about opening night. And much like Shoshanna, when she comes face to face with Hans Landa in the cafe unexpectedly, and he puts her through the ringer, she has to hold it together. And as soon as he's gone, she has to let out all the tension.
Absolutely. Along with the audience.
And I would imagine that Tarantino, being the film scholar that he is, had seen The Last Metro. And again, I find there's some interesting similarities there, though not in a parody way.
There's several movies we've talked about, Last Metro, To Be or Not to Be, Mephisto, where there's questions of performance and how we put forward a certain performance, how the Nazis demand a certain performance, how they themselves are a performance. You would mention Landa being performative. And so these themes of performance and fascism and how we play these roles and what the role of art is in survival and resistance. And in The Last Metro, the Catherine Deneuve character, just her act of resistance is merely keeping art alive. And what I like about Inglourious Basterds is that Shoshanna is not just keeping art alive, she's turning art into a weapon. And so cinema becomes the weapon through which Nazis are killed. And this is what I love about the movie, is that I think that metaphor is essentially saying that Hollywood destroyed Nazis, not just during World War II, but for the last 80 years. Hollywood has killed Nazis on screen over and over and over again. And this explosion of the theater, the burning of the film, is a metaphor for that.
And that's an excellent point. And it does bring in like where, and it's funny, on our old show or our other show, stuff we've seen many, many years ago, because it's been a while since Tarantino's made a film. When we were discussing Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, we talked about several of his films and we talked about Inglourious Basterds. But for the sake of this show, I'm assuming that most people have seen this film. And, again, sorry, but for the spoilers, you can shut it off now if you haven't heard it. But that notion, as you said, cinema has killed countless Nazis over and over again. However, when it came to Hitler took his own life. And there have been movies that have covered that.
There's an entire subgenre of movies about Hitler dying in the bunker. There's at least 5 or 6 of them.
And we call those bunker movies. And I've seen a good 6 or 7 of them. And I know it's funny is I don't really recall if they ever they always seem to cut off screen before he shoots himself.
Yeah, they never show that.
And so I feel as a audience, the big hoorah, like the most
cathartic part. Yeah.
The most cathartic part would be, we don't get to see the good guys kill Hitler.
Right. Yeah. We no movie gives us that satisfying ending of the Allied forces killing Hitler. It would be so exciting and satisfying.
And then Tarantino does it. And in the way he does it is so shocking and definitive. And then it ties in the Once Upon a Time. If you didn't quite get his approach there at the beginning of the movie, which would be easy on first watch.
Yeah.
He repeats some of the things that he's done in even Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And somehow he still makes it successful. But the first time, and you know, and I know, going into that theater, opening weekend is when I saw it, and not knowing, because I didn't want to know all the details. And so not knowing that Hitler gets killed, I'm in a theater with a good 400 people, and the insanity that was going on when that happened. And when we talk about giving the audience what it really wants, they wanted that.
I think it is something the audience has wanted, though, right? We want to see, we do get into the violence a little bit. We do feel like some of this violence is cathartic and justified. We do feel like morally violence against Nazis is justified, particularly in the World War II setting where any violence against them is essentially self-defense. But we get into that catharsis of the violence, and we like seeing Hitler killed. That's Tarantino is giving a gift to cinema audiences. People have been watching Nazis in movies for the last 80 years, and here we finally get to see Hitler get his.
The one knock that people have on Tarantino, they always talk about his excessive use of violence. Interestingly enough, Tarantino does not like sex scenes and has never filmed one.
Right.
He doesn't show nudity in his movies. However, on the violent side, he can be pretty graphic. And in this film, it's not just someone gets shot. He goes about as far as you possibly can for the violence. And this is where I think he is strategically making a point. He wants the audience to be a little bit complicit and to call them out a bit, because there is the scene that happens with the character played by Eli Roth called the Jew Bear.
Yes.
And it's a scene where they're interrogating a couple of captured Nazi captains or whatever they are, lieutenants. And essentially, the threat is of not telling the bastards what they need to know is the Jew Bear is going to beat them to death with a baseball bat.
A very American weapon.
A very American weapon, right. Because that was the national pastime then.
Exactly, yeah.
And I remember the pit in my stomach, right? Because the tension is that, oh my God, you don't think you're ever going to get to that moment. That's what tension is about getting you to the point, but then something happens to relieve that tension where they don't actually get their head bashed in. Or the camera moves away and goes off into another scene, right? But you know what's happening. But Tarantino shows the head bashing in this film.
He shows it, and it's a little bit sickening.
And yet we've never, at that point, I don't think in cinema, we'd really seen something like that. And I think he's saying that this is also revenge for all the Jews who died at the hands of the Nazis. But at the same time, in order to get that revenge, there's violence. And you, the audience, if this is what you want to see them get theirs, well, now I'm going to show it to you. And then you have to wrestle with, how are you feeling about this now? Are you feeling satisfied? Are you like rah-rah? Or are you kind of sickened? And it's a saying that, this kind of violence shouldn't exist.
Yeah, or is it sort of a combination of all of those in the sense that it's really morally complex, that we feel that maybe the violence is justified, but if it goes too far and indulges the violent aspect too much, then maybe we recoil from that. I think it's really asking the audience some moral questions about whether we approve of violence, to what extent we approve of it. Do we enjoy it, or are we repulsed by it? And I think that film confronts us with those questions in a setting which is really morally clear from, as we started off talking, about Nazis being evil and the moral clarity of that. And even in that moral clarity, we have some questions about the violence and how it operates and whether it's something we actually do approve of. Because I think there's a lot of people who don't like the violence in this movie and find it off-putting.
Yeah, but then what? Like if we don't have that violence, right, and they sanitize it, what is the takeaway?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that this movie confronts us in how we watch movies about Nazis. It's asking us to question our own viewing habits over the last 80 years and how we felt about Nazis in these movies and how we felt about the violence towards them.
Now, as we wrap up this episode, I have a question for you. It's a bit of a loaded question. And I don't think, and it does, and I think you're going to discover the trap that I'm going to put you in.
Okay.
But I'm going to ask you this. Would you say that the bastards, the people who are the group that we root for in this movie,
yeah,
right, which is Brad Pitt and all the rest, would you say that they are anti-fascist?
Yes.
So we are rooting for the anti-fascist to conquer fascism, correct?
Yes.
What would the acronym of anti-fascist be?
Well, like I said, it depends on what country you come from.
If you come from America, what would it be?
In America, it's Antifa, or as some people pronounce it, Antifa, which is actually just a way of making it sound foreign and more threatening. In other English-speaking countries, they refer to it as anti-fash, not Antifa or Antifa, anti-fash.
Got it. So Antifa or Antifa stands for anti-fascist. So you're against fascism, right?
Correct.
And the Nazis were fascist, right?
Yes. So anyone who's against Nazis is anti-fascist.
I'm just, sometimes I need the clarification. I'm not trying to say, I'm not calling any group or anything. I'm just trying to understand if you think that the bastards were anti-fascist.
Yes, they absolutely are anti-fascist. Now, we can discuss the morals of their methods, perhaps,
it's true.
But their ideology is pretty. I mean, when Aldo Rain says, "I want you to bring me 100 Nazi scalps," we're not really questioning what his motives are, what side he's on here.
And we don't know what the individual bastards' political affiliations would be, but we do know that they were against fascism.
I think all the bastards are personally motivated in some way to kill Nazis. It is personal for them too, not just ideological.
Well, they were hand-selected.
Yes, exactly.
And of course, Tarantino, one of his favorite films, and what's interesting is, and this is why I think he brings in some of this moral ambiguity into the film, is the Dirty Dozen.
Yes.
And the Dirty Dozen has assembled a bunch of men who were in the army and they were in prison, the stockades, for various reasons. Some of them were sentenced to death for different crimes. And they are given a chance at potential commuting of their sentences if they carry out this mission and survive. And the mission is to go behind the enemy lines the night before D-Day in order to cause a disruption and to make the enemy think that invasion's coming from somewhere else. But what happens, and I remember even the first time I saw Dirty Dozen, it was kind of shocking because, when you see it as a younger, you see something happening, but you can't believe it's really happening.
Right.
And it's the scene where the Dirty Dozen locks up all of the guests at this chateau.
Oh, yeah.
And then they throw grenades and gasoline down and kill them all.
Mm-hmm.
You're as a kid wrestling with, wait a second, so it's like, the bastards are sent there, right, to kill the enemies. They're killing the Nazis, but somehow in the way in which you're killed can be more disturbing. And then this is extremely disturbing.
It's extremely disturbing. Yeah. And when heroes sort of go on these murder sprees, it complicates our feelings about them. What my big takeaways from this are the idea of cinema as a weapon, and that in a way Tarantino, or rather the movies, have the final say and the last laugh here. This idea that movies have really created how we perceive Nazis and how we think about Nazis and how we think about the war is really being influenced by cinema. And cinema is a weapon of propaganda, a form of catharsis, a way of making the audience complicit in all of this. And the other thing that I find really interesting is that Tarantino has made history into a fairy tale. And he did it again. Well, he's done it a few times, but taking those elements and putting them essentially into a fairy tale format and then giving the audience what we want but making us feel a little bit sick about it, for me, ends up making it really powerful. And in my mind, I think you said you weren't sure how deep it was about these things, but I actually think this has more depth than several Tarantino films. And because of that, because of the message of the film, that's why I find it so rewatchable.
Well, again, once we tackle almost any of these movies, and this is what's exciting about talking about them, is we uncover new things. If we're looking at a film for a very specific lens, and some of these films were created just for one purpose, and a lot of those that were in the 40s, they were propaganda, and it was to encourage America to get behind why we need to fight these evil bastards.
Exactly.
And what we've discovered time and time again, and what we realize when we look at today's lens, that so many of those films, it's jarring because the message coming from Hollywood, but to America, was authoritarianism is a bad thing, and we don't want it. We like freedom of thought, and we like freedom of expression, and all the freedoms that we have in America. This is the dream. And then yet now, a lot of people don't want that.
Yeah, and that's it's sad and shocking to see. Anyhow, and so what's coming up on our next episode?
Next episode, we got a good one. This was a film that, again, if you haven't seen it, and I don't take for granted that anybody's seen everything, but this is a film that everybody, out of all the titles that we're talking about, I think a lot of people have seen this, and maybe countless times, and yet maybe they watch it for different reasons. And so that's what makes it exciting to talk about next week. And that is Michael Cortez's Casablanca with Humphrey Bogart.
The little-known Hollywood propaganda film from 43.
It actually came out like the end of 42, 43, it debuted, and it won Best Picture that year.
Yes. Deservedly so.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that on the next episode of Fascism on Film. And you can find us on fascismonfilm.com and on various podcast stations like Apple Podcasts. Please, if you enjoy it, tell some people about it. So, till next time, I'm James Kent, and this is Teal Minton.